Stop whatever you are doing right now because the story we are about to break down is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things happening in professional tennis and possibly in professional sports right now. Not in 10 years, not eventually. Right now, today, in real time, as tickets are being sold, stadiums are being filled, and tournament organizers across 3 continents are scrambling to figure out how a 20-year-old girl from the Philippines is single-handedly rewriting the rulebook on what it means to be a sports superstar in 2026. Because here is the number that started all of this. Here is the number that tennis experts are still struggling to process, still shaking their heads over, still pulling up on their phones to show other people in disbelief. Alex Eala's pre-tournament press conference at the 2026 Australian Open pulled 171,000 views. 171,000. Now hold that number in your mind for a moment. Then let the comparison land. Novak Djokovic, the most decorated men's tennis player in the history of the sport, owner of 24 Grand Slam titles, a man who has been the center of the tennis universe for the better part of 2 decades, pulled 80,000 views at the same event. Aryna Sabalenka, the reigning world #1 in women's tennis, a multi-Grand Slam champion whose ground strokes hit with enough force to rattle the entire back wall of any arena on the planet, 9,000 views. 9,000. Sabalenka drew 9,000 views to her press conference. Djokovic drew 80,000. Eala drew 171,000. That is nearly twice as many as Djokovic and nearly 20 times as many as the world #1 in women's tennis. Read those numbers out loud if you need to. They do not get less extraordinary on the second reading. And nobody in the tennis world is pretending that is a normal statistic. Not the analysts, not the former players, not the tournament directors, not the executives sitting in offices trying to figure out how to package and sell the next generation of the sport. Those numbers represent something real, something seismic, something that experts are now publicly discussing in terms that are completely unambiguous. Former ATP professionals Sam Querrey and Steve Johnson recently sat down and asked the question out loud that the entire sport has been quietly thinking about for months. Is Alex Eala the biggest draw in women's tennis right now? And Steve Johnson's answer was not hedged, not qualified, not softened with the usual diplomatic sports media language where everyone is described as a great competitor with a bright future. His answer was yes. Full stop. Now, biggest draw is a very specific term, and it is worth slowing down to unpack it properly, because it is not the same as saying best player. It is not the same as saying highest ranked. Biggest draw means one specific thing. Who puts people in seats? Who crashes servers? Who makes ticket prices spike? Who forces organizers to rethink their crowd management plans before a match even starts? Who is the name that, when it appears on a draw sheet, causes people who have never watched a single tennis match in their lives to suddenly find themselves buying tickets, setting alarms, and canceling dinner plans? On that precise and specific question, in early 2026, the case for Alex Eala is not just compelling, it is almost impossible to argue against. Let us go back to Australia, because that is where this current wave of expert attention really crystallized, and where the footage started circulating in a way that made even skeptical observers pay attention. The scenes around Eala's matches at the Australian Open were described by people covering them as wild, not enthusiastic, not well attended, wild. Lines for her court stretching distances that commentators were openly exaggerating and laughing about because the real distances were already remarkable enough. A Filipino fan presence that was not just large but organized, loud, emotionally invested, and persistent in a way that felt fundamentally different from a typical tennis crowd. Stadium atmospheres for a player ranked outside the top 30 at the time that had the energy of a quarterfinal match involving a top seed, which is simply not supposed to happen based on any existing tennis formula. The calculus of ranking equals audience engagement does not apply to Alex Eala, and the Australian Open made that undeniably clear. But here is what makes the situation even more extraordinary than the Australian Open footage alone suggests. This is not isolated to one country, one tournament, or one moment in time. The traveling support that Eala draws is genuinely global and genuinely relentless. In 2026 alone, she has been packing stadiums in Manila, Auckland, Melbourne, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Dubai. She has been doing it at events of varying sizes and prestige levels, on different surfaces, in different time zones, in front of different demographic mixes. The common thread is always the same enormous, passionate, organized fan presence that behaves less like a tennis audience and more like a fan base that has been counting down the days to see their person. And now she is arriving in Indian Wells, California for the BNP Paribas Open, which is widely considered the unofficial fifth Grand Slam, one of the most prestigious and well-attended tennis events on the entire calendar. And California is home to the largest Filipino population of any state in the United States, sitting at nearly 2 million people. You do the math on what that means for attendance patterns when Alex Eala is seeded and playing in the main draw for the very first time in her career. That is right. This is Eala's first time competing at Indian Wells as a seeded player, having entered the tournament at world number 32, down one spot from her career high of 31 following a week off between Dubai and Indian Wells. She has earned a first-round bye, which means she advances directly to the second round, where she will face one of the winners from qualifying. Indian Wells is a 96-player draw featuring the entire top 10 in women's tennis. World number 1, Aryna Sabalenka. World number 2, Iga Swiatek. World number 3, Elena Rybakina. Coco Gauff at 4. Jessica Pegula at 5. Reigning champion, Mira Andreeva. Every name that matters in women's tennis is in this draw. And right alongside them, at number 32, making her seeded debut at Tennis Paradise, is the player who is currently generating more viewership, more crowd energy, and more commercial conversation than almost any other name in the sport. Before we go any further into what Indian Wells might look like, let us properly establish why the expert conversation around Eala has moved past careful and measured language and into something much more direct and urgent. Because the comparisons being made are not small, they are not casual. They reveal exactly how unusual this situation is and how far outside normal tennis territory it has already traveled. When analysts tried to find the closest historical comparison for the kind of traveling, global, cross-cultural fan support that Alex Eala generates, one name came up immediately: Sonia Mirza. Now, for anyone who needs context on exactly how significant that comparison is, consider this. Sonia Mirza today has nearly 13 million followers on Instagram. That is approximately 5 million more than Carlos Alcaraz, one of the most popular young male tennis players in the world and a multiple Grand Slam champion. That is roughly as many followers as Alcaraz and Sabalenka combined. Mirza built that kind of cultural footprint by becoming a genuine national icon for India, a symbol of what was possible for a young woman from a country that had not traditionally produced world-class tennis talent, a player whose results on court were matched by an emotional resonance off it that crossed every boundary the sport normally respects. Indian fans followed her across the globe at the peak of her career, and they never stopped. They are still following her, 13 million of them. That is what the experts reached for when they tried to describe Alex Eala. And then they said the ceiling is higher, not equally high, higher. And then someone in the conversation reached further still, past Mirza, past the boundaries of tennis entirely, and landed on Manny Pacquiao, which tells you everything you need to know about the frame of reference being applied here. At the peak of his career, Manny Pacquiao was one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. In the Philippines, his fights were not sporting events. They were national pauses. Crime rates dropped on the nights he fought. Streets emptied. The entire country reorganized its schedule around his performance. At his commercial peak, he was reportedly generating total earnings in the same territory as Roger Federer, one of the greatest athletes of any era in any sport. Tournament directors in the Middle East and Southeast Asia have already been drawing this comparison openly when discussing Eala's commercial profile and her trajectory. When professional tennis analysts and former players reach for Manny Pacquiao as the closest available reference point, the conversation has officially, permanently, and irreversibly left normal tennis territory. Now let us anchor all of this to the actual tennis. because influence without performance is a story that ends quickly in professional sport, and Alex Eala knows that better than anyone. The on-court results are not just decent, they are genuinely impressive, and they are trending in exactly the right direction at exactly the right moment. Her 2025 season was where the mainstream tennis world first sat up and paid full attention, the Miami Open run that changed everything. Entering as a wildcard ranked 140 in the world, she did not just compete with Grand Slam champions. She eliminated them one by one. Jelena Ostapenko, Madison Keys, then Iga Swiatek. 3 Grand Slam winners, dispatched in sequence by a player who was not even supposed to be in the main draw. She eventually fell to Jessica Pegula in the semifinals, but by then, the calculus had changed completely. She backed that up with a finalist appearance at the Eastbourne Open, a first WTA 125 title at the Guadalajara Open in Mexico, a Grand Slam main draw debut at the French Open, and, in the moment that made an entire nation weep, her first Grand Slam singles match victory at the 2025 US Open, defeating Clara Tauson to become the first Filipino player in the Open era to win a match at a major. She ended 2025 ranked 50 in the world, a career high at that point, a number that had seemed almost unimaginable 12 months earlier. Then, 2026 arrived and she did not pause for a moment. Auckland semi-final, exhibition title in Kooyong, Australian Open main draw debut, Philippine Women's Open quarterfinal, Abu Dhabi Open quarterfinal, where she also reached the doubles semi-finals alongside Indonesian partner Janice Jen, and then Dubai, where she produced the result that pushed her to a career-high 31 in the world. She defeated Sorana Cirstea and then upset Jasmine Paolini, the world number 7 at the time, a Grand Slam champion, one of the most experienced players on tour, and marched into the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 event for the 3rd time in her career. The run only ended when she ran into Coco Gauff, the world number 4, who won in straight sets, which is a result against a top 5 player that requires absolutely no apology. She arrives at Indian Wells with a 10-6 record for the 2026 season. She is the first Filipino player ever to be seeded at a WTA 1000 event. She trained in California with Laura Siegemund and Solana Sierra ahead of the tournament, which is exactly the kind of preparation detail that suggests she understands the stakes of this particular moment in her career. Because there is something beyond the excitement and the crowd energy and the press conference view counts that makes Indian Wells critically important from a pure tennis standpoint. She has a significant number of ranking points from her 2025 Miami run to defend later this month. A strong performance at Indian Wells could relieve some of that pressure considerably, allowing her to approach Miami with confidence rather than anxiety. The timing, in other words, is not neutral. This tournament matters competitively in ways that go beyond the obvious. The technical profile that analysts have identified as her foundation is worth understanding because it explains both where she is now and why the ceiling projections are so high. The hand-eye coordination is described by coaches as exceptional. Her ability to take the ball early to shorten the time an opponent has to recover position and reset is her primary structural weapon. It changes the geometry of points in ways that higher-ranked opponents have found difficult to solve. This is not an aesthetic quality. It is not about style or entertainment value, though those things are certainly present. It is a real tactical advantage that disrupts the rhythm of players who are accustomed to controlling points from a certain tempo. The left-handed game adds another layer of complexity because the angles it produces are ones that right-handed opponents spend far less time practicing against. The combination produces a game that is both technically sound and genuinely disruptive at the WTA 1000 level. There is a note of caution that serious analysts have flagged, and it deserves to be addressed honestly rather than glossed over. Eala's results on slower hard courts have been more uneven than her results on faster surfaces. Her Guadalajara title came in high altitude, fast conditions in Mexico. Her Miami Miracle run unfolded on courts that suit aggressive early ball striking. Her loss in the first round of the Qatar Open, which plays on some of the slowest hard court surfaces on tour, followed that pattern. Indian Wells sits somewhere in the middle of the speed spectrum, not as fast as Miami, not as slow as Qatar. It is the kind of surface where her game can absolutely function at a high level, but where she will need to demonstrate the kind of consistent baseline depth and tactical variation that separates players who go deep at major events from players who go out in the early rounds. This is the challenge. This is what makes Indian Wells genuinely interesting from a tennis perspective beyond all the fan base and viewership noise. But here is the broader picture that frames everything else and explains why the experts are not just talking about Alex Eala as an interesting story. They are talking about her as a structural force in the sport's commercial future. Women's tennis is in the middle of one of its most important generational transitions in decades. Serena Williams is retired. Her presence guaranteed television ratings, stadium sellouts, and global cultural attention in volumes that no single successor has yet replicated. The tour is building a constellation of new stars: Sabalenka, Swiatek, Gauff, Pegula, Andreeva. Each elite, each compelling, each capable of winning the biggest titles on the biggest stages. But the sport needs something specific that rankings and trophies alone cannot manufacture. It needs crossover magnetism. It needs the ability to pull audiences who are not already tennis fans into stadiums and onto streaming platforms. It needs faces that resonate beyond the sport's traditional demographics and traditional markets. Alex Eala provides that in ways the WTA has been searching for since Serena left. She does not just attract Filipino fans, though the Filipino community's devotion to her is extraordinary and represents a commercial and cultural opportunity that the sport is only beginning to understand. She attracts the attention of young people across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, who see someone who looks like them, comes from where they come from, and competes on the biggest stages in the world without apology. That emotional engine does not run on rankings. It runs on identity, aspiration, and the specific electricity that occurs when a community that has historically been underrepresented in a sport suddenly has someone at its highest levels who carries their flag. When that happens, engagement is not passive. It is ferocious. Novak Djokovic, a man who has won 24 Grand Slams, who has seen every iteration of tennis fandom that has existed over the past 3 decades, who is not easily impressed by crowd dynamics, reportedly called the surge around Alex Eala a good problem for tennis. When Djokovic says that, the statement deserves full weight. He is not being polite. He has no particular reason to be. He is describing something he is observing in real time, an unusual concentration of passionate, loyal, loud support around a player who would not typically command that kind of attention based on ranking alone. He is recognizing that whatever is happening with Eala is not a temporary spike or a social media trend that will flatten out in 3 months. It is something more durable than that. Something that has been building match by match, tournament by tournament, across multiple continents and multiple time zones since Miami in 2025. The social media reality reinforces everything the crowd data suggests. Eala belongs to the generation that is native to short-form video content, direct audience engagement, and the kind of platform presence that turns a sporting moment into a cultural event that spreads far beyond the audience that was already watching. Her wins circulate. Her interviews translate. The warmth and personality that analysts mention, the smile that one commentator described as lighting up a room with complete sincerity, is not a minor detail in the modern sports media landscape. In the attention economy, warmth and authenticity are not cosmetic. They are the mechanism by which a sports moment becomes a shareable cultural event that reaches people who were not looking for tennis when they woke up that morning. That is the kind of organic reach that no marketing budget can manufacture and no PR strategy can replicate once it disappears. You either have it or you do not. Eala has it in quantities that analysts are struggling to fully measure. The comparison to Coco Gauff is the one that is now circulating most frequently in expert circles, and it is worth examining carefully. Gauff built the template in recent years for what a young women's player with genuine mainstream crossover appeal can look like. The commercial opportunities, the cultural visibility, the ability to reach audiences who would not otherwise be watching tennis. She is a Grand Slam champion and a top 5 player. The ranking gap between Gauff and Eala is real, and it should not be minimized. But what observers tracking digital engagement metrics are now noting is that within Southeast Asia specifically, Eala's raw viewership numbers and social engagement are already moving in Gauff's territory. That is a significant sentence. A player ranked 32 is generating the kind of regional audience pull that typically belongs to players in the top 5. The usual correlation between ranking and audience size is simply not holding in her case, and the gap between her cultural footprint and her competitive ranking is the most interesting tension in women's tennis right now. What does all of this mean for where Indian Wells goes? The expectation from people who track these patterns professionally is that the Filipino fan presence in California will be enormous. Nearly 2 million Filipinos live in the state. A significant portion of them are within driving distance of the Indian Wells Tennis Garden. For the first time ever, they will be watching Eala compete at this event as a seeded player, a legitimate top 30 competitor rather than a wild card or a qualifier. The atmosphere around her matches is anticipated to be unlike anything Indian Wells has typically produced for a player ranked outside the top 15. Organizers who have been watching the crowd dynamics around her matches at other events this year are already making contingency plans. The comparison to her Australian Open scenes, those lines that stretched unreasonably far, those atmospheres that belonged in a different round of a different draw, is the reference point being used.